Hello everybody, welcome to the Thursday edition of Video Clips. And the first thing I want to talk about is eating patterns around the world. So let's start with some good news. All over the world, people are eating more good foods like fruits and vegetables. Again, good news. Here's the bad news. They're eating even more unhealthy foods like processed meats and sweet drinks. This data comes from a study that looked at dietary patterns in 187 countries in which 4.5 billion adults live. Between 1990 and 2010, the biggest improvements were in higher income countries, but people living in those wealthiest countries still have the worst diets because they have some of the highest intake of processed and unhealthy foods in the world. So the increase in fruits and vegetables offset by the increase in the bad stuff. These countries, won't surprise you here, include the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. Some countries, for example, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, China, and India, haven't improved diets at all in the last 20 years, and poverty has a lot to do with that. So the analysis included looking at the intake of 17 food items and nutrients known to be related to obesity and common degenerative diseases like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. The researchers looked at 3 dietary patterns, a health-promoting diet, an unhealthy pattern, and then a general pattern, just looking at all the 17 foods and nutrients. The researchers determined that dietary patterns varied based on national income. People in wealthier countries ate more healthy foods, but they had worse dietary patterns because of the unhealthy foods that they also ate regularly. And of course, part of the reason for that is you have to have money to eat the bad stuff we eat in this country. You know, if you look at some of the rural areas of in China, Northern Africa, some places where people eat healthier diets, on $350 a year per person in income, you're not going to eat a lot of stuff from vending machines. You're not going to be eating thick porterhouse steaks and fried foods and candy and soft drinks. The highest scores for healthy foods were given to many low-income countries such as Chad and Mali, and this is evidence of what Dr. T. Colin Campbell has observed in population studies, that these eating patterns tend to be based on poverty because people can't afford all the expensive animal foods and processed foods. But then you see the clear delineation between diseases of affluence and diseases of poverty. Diseases of affluence are all the chronic degenerative conditions that come from eating all of this expensive animal food and processed food. Lowest scores were given to Central European countries and countries that were once part of the Soviet Union. Now here's the distressing thing. The researchers concluded that if the trend continues, by the year 2020, we can expect that 75% of all deaths will be a result of degenerative disease, and they pointed out that dietary improvement could play a major role in reducing the death rate. I agree, and the incidence of disease for that matter. They called on governments and other organizations worldwide to help people adopt optimal diets in order to reduce the obesity and disease rate. Now, I'm all for calling on help, but take a look at our government, and I wrote about this last week and talked about it on Video Clips. The USDA's Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee just retracted its advice on restricting cholesterol. And I won't go into all of that all over again, but I don't think we're going to count on the government to fix these situations. I'm counting on you guys to spread videos around like this and enroll people in well-informed health programs. Let everybody become an informed consumer. It leads to making the right choices about diet. All right, now once in a while government gets it right. I'm going to give you an example here. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force has concluded that there is insufficient evidence to warrant screening for thyroid dysfunction in adults who are not pregnant and have no symptoms. This is the 3rd time the task force has published the same recommendations. First time was about 10 years ago. Task Force member Jessica Hertzine noted that screening asymptomatic adults has become a common practice, but, and this is a quote, there is very limited evidence that evaluates whether these practices lead to improved health outcomes. On the other hand, and this is a quote, indirect evidence points to the likelihood of important and frequent harms associated with screening asymptomatic persons, writes Michael Lefebvre and colleagues on behalf of the USPSTF. All right, so those harms include false positives, the stress associated with being diagnosed with a disease when you don't have it. The researchers also noted that there is no reliable set of consistent clinical symptoms that defines thyroid dysfunction. Now, the data were analyzed this way. The researchers looked at randomized controlled trials and observational studies of screening and treatment. They could find none at all that evaluate the benefits and harms of screening by comparing screened and non-screened individuals. In other words, we've jumped off the cliff on this thyroid testing thing without reliable evidence. They determined that screening asymptomatic people can identify abnormal thyroid-stimulating hormone or TSH levels, but that, quote, what constitutes an abnormal TSH level is uncertain, end of quote. They also stated that normal levels vary among age groups. For example, older adults tend to have higher levels than younger adults, but this doesn't necessarily mean that anything is wrong. Dr. Kenneth Berman, chief of the endocrinology section at MedStar Washington Hospital Center, added that there is no proof that mildly abnormal TSH levels cause any significant medical issue. Of course, those who make their livings finding and treating thyroid dysfunction have an entirely different point of view. The American Thyroid Association and the American Association of Clinical Endocrinology both recommend that patients over 60 be screened, and this was the exact wording, aggressively look for thyroid disease in patients who are at high risk. Mark Harrell, the president of the Endocrinology Association, says, this is a quote, "My fear is that the USPSTF statement about a lack of data to justify thyroid disease screening will be incorrectly interpreted as a lack of clinical need to find and treat thyroid disease." And then he went on to say that none of this is going to change his practices. Well, I'm sure it won't. Business wouldn't be nearly as good if he no longer aggressively looks for thyroid disease. Diagnosing thyroid dysfunction, particularly non-autoimmune hypothyroidism, has become a major disease-mongering activity. And there are so many things that have contributed to it. For example, for many years, normal TSH levels were between 0.5 and 5.0. In 2002, the Endocrinology Association revised the definition of normal to 0.3 to 3.0. This immediately resulted in millions of people who previously were not diagnosed with hypothyroidism being labeled as diseased. Some doctors even suggest that the limit should be lower at 2.5. This even results in more people being diagnosed as diseased. Added to the insanity are numerous online sites promoting the idea that many, if not most people, have a condition called subclinical hypothyroidism, which cannot be detected with blood tests. These sites feature lists of symptoms that are so numerous and vague that they result in almost all people concluding that they need treatment. While patients used to request testing for thyroid dysfunction based on symptoms, many doctors now just order tests as standard operating procedure for all patients. It's almost certain that more people are being diagnosed with abnormalities that are interpreted to mean thyroid disease, and overtreatment ensues. This is aggravated by the expanded definition of hypothyroidism. Abnormal test results for markers of thyroid disease should be carefully considered before any action is taken. And by the way, this type of information is why you want to take part in our Informed Medical Consumer series, which starts in May. It's a $1,700 program you can get for $199. You definitely need this kind of information. All done through interactive teleconference. You can be any place on the planet and participate. All right, that's all for today. It's all for the week. As usual, pass this on to anybody who you think might enjoy watching it, and I will be back to you again on Tuesday with more news.